All right. Good evening, everybody. We're super excited to have everyone back for the seventh night of the Master Beef webinar series here in 2024. I feel like it's flown by this year. We only have one more night, so hopefully we'll see everybody again Thursday night as well after today. But as everyone starts to flood in tonight, just again a few housekeeping rules like we have every night. If you have a question regarding attendance or certification, be sure to email me and I can put my email back in the chat box here tonight so we can get that stuff taken care of. Or if you have a question you want answered tonight, I can answer those. If you have a question for our speaker tonight, be sure to drop those in the Q&A and chat box, or the Q&A and chat box as well, and we'll get those taken care for you. Similar to how we've done the other nights. And again, if you needed to watch a recording or anything like that, reach out to me or your local extension agent and we'll get you in touch with those for your certifications. But with all that being said, I'm going to let our speaker, Dr. Fontes from the University of Georgia, get us started. So again, thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Fontes.
Well, thank you, Mallory. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always nice. I think it's the second time that I speak at this program here with folks from University of Tennessee. You guys are not very far from here, so I'm in the north part of the state here, so I'm not. It's not a very far drive to Tennessee. I'm actually there quite often, so it is for sure a pleasure to be here. As Mallory was saying, my name is Pedro Fontes. I am an assistant professor and extension specialist with the University of Georgia, with the Department of Animal and Dairy Science. And my background is with beef cattle reproduction, similar to Dr. Zoka from last week. I work mostly with beef cow fertility. Dr. Zoka does a lot of work on the male. I do most of my work on the female, a little bit on the male as well, but a little bit of a mix. Okay, so the topic that Mallory reached out to me and asked me to talk about is give everybody an overview of some of the factors that influence fertility and pregnancy rates in beef cows. So that's what I'm going to try to accomplish today. So as we get started here, I think the main point I want to make to get the conversation started, I guess, is to understand the challenges of a beef cow, right, from a fertility standpoint. Being a beef cow is hard work, right? That's one of the things that I always try to convey, and sometimes we underestimate the amount of challenges that those cows undergo, mainly when we're talking about postpartum cows, right? If you think about the traditional expectations that we have for beef cows, right? We know that those cows have to maintain a 365-day calving interval in order to be profitable, right? And in order to accomplish that, we expect those cows not only to calve every 365 days, but also do that hopefully without assistance, right? Without us having to go in and have any type of intervention. From a commercial cow herd standpoint, we also expect that cow produces a calf that is genetically capable to perform, right? So about half of the genetic makeup of that calf comes from the genetics of the cow. So that's something to consider as well. But not only that, we expect that those cows also provide the condition for those calves so that those calves can express their genetic potential. And not only that, we also expect those cows to accomplish all of this under a specific production environment where those cows are located, right? So not only cows have to meet all those production goals, but also they have to do that under the production environment that we generate to those cows. And ideally, in order to remain profitable, very often we try to have a lower input system in order to maintain costs as low as we can, right? So from a job expectation for a beef cow, you can see that we expect a lot from those cows. And if you think about the actual breeding opportunity that those cows have to become pregnant and calve every year, every 365 days, we know that the gestation length of a cow is anywhere between 280 and 285 days, right? For our Boss Stars breeds. And if you subtract 285 from 365 days in a given year, we're left with only about 80 days. All right. So if we go there and think about those 80 days that we're left with, the reality is we know that those cows will spend about 30 days undergoing what we call uterine involution. Right. When those cows calve, they're going to be, right before calving, they're going to be carrying over 100 pounds of a mix of calf and a lot of fluids in the uterus. That uterus is really enlarged, right? And we know that after the cow calves, that uterus have to go through that process of uterine involution, and that'll last close to around 30 days. So the reality is, if we go there and do the calculation here, those cows have an actual breeding opportunity of about 50 days. Which is not a lot if you think about a cow, a beef cow with a 21-day estrus cycle. That gives those cows less than 3 opportunities to breed on a given year. So for those cows to maintain a 365-day calving interval, it's something really challenging, okay? And we expect a lot from those cows. But one of the points that I want to make here is also the fact that every time we talk about pregnancy rates or managing pregnancy rates, unfortunately, pregnancy rates are what we call production characteristics that have multifactorial, several factors influencing their outcome, right? So if you think about here, I'll tell you, this is a really simplified diagram of the factors that influence fertility. So here on the left side, I got the male component of fertility, right, which is associated with semen quality very often, right? We know that nutrition plays a key role. We know that biosecurity and health plays a big role in pregnancy rates as well. Handling and stress, the actual temperament, intrinsic temperament of those animals, and any type of stressor that those animals are exposed to are also going to influence their ability to breed. But not only that, we know that reproductive management also plays a role. And as an example of reproductive management strategy, here I have estrus synchronization, but there are a few other ones that we can talk about throughout our conversation here today. So as we move forward in my slides here, what I'm going to try to do is try to isolate some of these factors here, okay, and try to show you some examples on how each one of these factors are influencing fertility on the cow herd. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind as well is that there's a lot of factors that actually we don't know that they influence fertility yet from a research standpoint, right? So as I go through some of those factors that we know influence fertility and we try to manage those factors around our knowledge on those factors, it's important to keep in mind that we don't fully understand all the factors that influence fertility. So this is important to acknowledge as well. So the first factor that I wanted to start our conversation with, I think is probably the most important one, which is nutrition. We know that nutrition is probably the main driver of fertility in beef herds, not only in Tennessee, across the country, right, in Georgia as well. And you can think about nutrition in a more traditional way, right, from a body condition scoring standpoint, and we're going to touch on that. But not only that, we're learning a lot about some potential interventions from a nutrition standpoint, from a supplementation standpoint, from a mineral program standpoint. They're also influencing the nutritional aspect of cow herd fertility. Okay, so to get us off here, to get us started here, just want to point out. Let me hold on one second here. Just want to get started here showing you guys the relationship between body condition score at calving, okay, and pregnancy rates at the end of the breeding season. So here on the y-axis here we have the probability of pregnancy on a percentage basis, okay, and then here on the x-axis we have body condition score, and this is data compiled at the University of Florida by Dr. Philippe Muriel. This is a really nice compilation of several studies that they've been working on. Trying to understand the relationship between nutrition during late gestation and subsequent performance of the cow herd. not only from a cow herd fertility standpoint, but also from a programming of the performance of that calf. And they have recently published this showing that clear relationship that we're well aware of, right? So here you can see that as we increase body condition score at calving, right, we see a linear increase in the probability of cows becoming pregnant, right? And this is well established. We know that when those cows calve in a body condition score of less than 5, we know that the probability of those cows to breed in the subsequent breeding season goes down quite significantly, right? And this is just for you to keep in mind in a 1 to 9 scale here. But what's interesting about this recent report there from Dr. Muriel is that he actually took that a step further and broke that further down. That's what I'm going to show you here in this slide. So here on the left, you can see the cow body condition score calving. So here we have 2 categories of cows. We have the cows that calve with a body condition score lower than 5, and cows that calve with a body condition score of 5 or greater here. Okay, you can see this is a well-managed herd. This is a fall calving herd there in the Ona station in Florida. Okay, data from the southeast here. And you can see the bulk of the cow herd in this data set was calving with an adequate body condition score. We can go there and break down the pregnancy rates of those cows in the subsequent breeding season. You can see that the cows that calve with a body condition score lower than 5, they're less likely to become pregnant in the subsequent breeding season. But one of the neat things that Dr. Muriel did in this study, he actually broke each one of these categories down into cows that between body condition score, between calving and subsequent breeding, they went there and estimated the cows that lost, maintained, or gained body condition score. So this is what this represents here, the body condition score change from calving to breeding, okay? And what you can see here is that as we go through those cows that have a body condition score lower than 5, you can see that even if we get those cows to gain body weight after calving, which is hard to accomplish, right? If you think about that cow in the early postpartum period, she's producing a lot of milk, right? She's reaching peak lactation around the time we're turning bulls in, right? Her nutrient requirements are extremely high. She's undergoing that process of uterine involution, all those challenges that we talked about. It's really hard to get those cows to gain weight, but if we do gain weight, if those cows do gain condition, right, one of the things that I want to point out here to you is that they do not recover fertility to the same extent as cows that already calved in an adequate body condition score do. Okay, so you can see that there's not a significant difference here between those from a statistical standpoint, but the reality is if we increase the number of cows here, we would detect a statistical significance. And you can see that those cows, even if they calve, if they're behind from a body condition score standpoint, whenever they calve, you can see that even if we get those cows to gain, we would fail to recover fertility to an extent that we'll fail to get those cows to have the same fertility as cows that calve in an adequate body condition score. And what's interesting as well is that if you get cows to calve in an adequate body condition score, even if they lose, and you can see that the majority of the cows that calve with an adequate body condition score, they are in fact losing between between when they calve and when we're starting the breeding season. But even if they lose body condition score, half a unit there of body condition score, you know that those cows are still able to breed quite well. Not only that, I want to draw your attention to the proportion of cows that breed early in the season, because that's also important. So you can see that those cows that calve in a lower body condition score and they lose body condition score after calving, you can see that from an early calving standpoint, it's pretty much a train wreck here, right? So we really limit those abilities of the ability of those cows to stay in the herd and successfully breed early in the breeding season. So this is the same data, but looking in a different way. So here you have the probability of pregnancy here, and at the x-axis here, what I have is the body condition score change, and you can see that the red line here represents the cows that calve with an adequate body condition score, so of equal to 5 or greater, and the gray line represents the cows that calve with a lower body condition score than we were expecting. And you can see that for the cows that calve with an adequate body condition score, even if they lose body condition score, right? The magnitude of loss in pregnancy rates much less when you compare to the cows that calve with a lower body condition score. Okay, so just to keep in mind, the key component of having those cows calving in an adequate body condition score above 5, ideally we want to have those cows at a body condition score at least of a 6 there. Okay, I'm focusing our conversation here on the fertility side of things, but we know that the body condition score of those cows during late gestation, that it's ultimately what's going to be uh, driving the body condition score at calving, right? That's influencing a lot the development of that fetus in utero too, and that's actually influencing the performance of that calf postnatally. I'm not going to go into that, but this is important to keep in mind as we think about late gestation nutritional management of the cow herd. Another thing that another point that I'd like to make is that nutritional program from the nutritional status of our cow herd or our replacement heifers from a body condition standpoint, yeah, it's very clear that there's an effect there. But also subtle changes in nutrition in the nutritional program and the nutritional status of those cows also influence the ability of those females to successfully establish pregnancy. And I'm going to show you a couple of studies that really show that. Okay. So, a common practice, not as much for us here in the Southeast. A lot of us, are developing heifers in a grazing setup where we're supplementing those heifers, right, very often. As opposed to a common practice in the Midwest is, for folks who develop heifers in a dry lodge. And this is data out of South Dakota, okay? But bear with me, and I'll show you the relevance here. But, there's a variety of studies in that part of the country that shows that heifers that are developed in a grazing setting tend to have better pregnancy rates to artificial insemination when you compare to the heifers that are developed in a dry lodge. And in those series of studies, a lot of them led by Dr. George Perry, back when he was in South Dakota State, what they noticed is that those heifers that are managed or developed post-weaning in a dry lot setting, whenever we turn those heifers out, go there, expose them to a round of artificial insemination, and turn them out to graze, those heifers, they have a transient decrease in the rate of average daily gain, right? And even though about 30 days later they catch up from a body weight standpoint, what the researchers here were noticing is that those heifers, they lose condition for about 2 weeks. And very often they don't lose condition, they just don't gain as much as they were gaining. And in order to further explore that, they designed a really nice study to try to evaluate how subtle changes in energy intake on heifers influences the ability of those heifers to elicit proper embryonic development and properly establish a successful pregnancy. So this is the experimental design of this study from Dr. Perry's group. They basically had heifers in a controlled diet that basically those heifers were fed to gain about 1.5 pounds a day during their development period. And then they went there and exposed those heifers to one round of synchronization and a fixed timed AI, which was day 0 here of their experiment. And then the day of AI, those heifers were then randomly assigned to either be maintained in the same diet or to be exposed to a diet that they call it a restriction diet, which was 80% of their nutrient requirements in that restriction, anywhere between 80 and 50% of the requirements. And those dietary treatments here, they were superimposed for only 6 days. So a very short-term exposure to a lower plane of nutrition here, which is basically they were trying to mimic what was happening to those dry lot heifers that turn out to graze and they lose a little bit of condition, or they fail to gain at the same rate of body weight gain. And then 6 days later, they went there and collected an embryo. Okay, they performed an embryo flushing. They collected embryos from those heifers after that one round of artificial insemination, brought those embryos to a laboratory and evaluated the quality of those embryos. So here have the results from the study. So here you have the control group of heifers. Here we have the restriction group. Okay, and then as we go through this table here, we have the embryo recovery rate, embryo stage, embryo quality, total number of cells. So they basically counted the number of cells in each embryos, but not only that, they stained those embryos to try to identify which cells were alive and which cells were dead. And they counted the percentage of cells in those embryos that were alive. And what's pretty neat, as you can see, You can see that from an embryo stage standpoint, so the larger the number here, from an embryo quality standpoint, sorry, the larger the number here, the lower the quality of that embryo. So if you've been purchasing embryo, if you're in the seed stock business and you purchase an embryo, right, ideal quality embryo is a embryo grade 1. So as the embryo grade increases here, the quality of the embryo decreases. And you can see that the heifers that were in the control group had a better quality embryo score or embryo grading when you compare to the restriction group. But not only that, when you look at the embryo stage of development, you can see that the heifers in the control group had more developed embryos as well. So again, this is only a 6-day exposure to a partial nutrient restriction environment. Okay, that also changes the number of cells in those embryos and the number of cells that were alive. So you can see that a small subtle change in the nutritional program around the time of breeding can also influence the ability of those embryos to develop inside the reproductive tract of the heifer and consequently successfully establish a pregnancy, right? We usually think about nutrition influencing estrus expression and the number of cows that are going to actually express estrus during the breeding season or during the beginning of the breeding season after we expose those females to a round of synchronization. But the reality is they're also influencing the quality of that embryo after fertilization occurs, okay? So much more detailed description of the physiological event there. Not only that, what's interesting as well is that when we get cows in a negative energy balance, and this is a study that we did back when I was still working on my PhD program, where we basically had embryo recipient cows, and we exposed those cows to a 70% restriction from an energy standpoint, and those cows are all embryo recipients. And you can see here the percentage of pregnancy failure after those cows receive a good quality embryo. And you can see that the cows that were exposed to the restriction diet, they were more likely to experience pregnancy failure when you compare to the cows that were receiving 100% of their energy requirements. So again, we're not only influencing the ability of those cows to ovulate, but we're also influencing that uterine environment in a way that even if we get an embryo from a donor that is fed a good quality diet and is a good positive plane of nutrition, whenever that embryo goes into that uterine environment of a cow that is exposed to a nutrient restriction environment, the probability of that embryo to develop goes down. What was neat as well is that we collected blood samples on those cows in that study, and we measured things like insulin, IGF-1, NIFA, which are basically metabolic markers. Here I have, just as an example, insulin and IGF-1, which are positively associated with the energy balance of the cow. And you can see that as we increase the circulating concentrations of those hormones in the circulation of the cow, the probability of that cow to maintain pregnancy increases. Okay, so in other words, there's a direct relationship between the nutritional status of those cows and the ability of those embryos to develop in utero. Not only that, what's interesting is that we're learning that some specific nutrients can also influence the ability of embryos to develop. And I'm going to touch just in one of those so we can move forward with this, with our conversation here today. But basically, there's been quite a lot of research over the last 10 to 15 years investigating the impact of polyunsaturated fatty acids on pregnancy rates of beef cows. Okay, so if you're not familiar with polyunsaturated fatty acids, every time you hear someone talking about omega-6 or omega-3 fatty acids, they're usually referring to polyunsaturated fatty acids. And a common source that we have commercially available for producers to utilize of omega-6 fatty acids is calcium salts of soybean oil, and that's what CSSO stands for here. Okay, there's been a variety of studies that have investigating the impact of those polyunsaturated fatty acids on the ability of cows to become pregnant. And what those studies shown, and I'm going to try to summarize them here for sake of time, but basically what scientists were able to show is that whenever we feed cows a diet that is rich in omega-6 fatty acids, we are able to change the amount of omega-6 fatty acids in the uterus. Okay. Not only that, we change the amount of omega-6 fatty acids in the uterine fluid. But what those scientists also have done is they actually flush embryos or conceptuses from cows that were being fed those omega-6 fatty acids, and they measured the amount of omega-6 fatty acids in the conceptus, and they were able to show that if a cow is receiving omega-6 fatty acid supplement, the concentration of those fatty acids in the conceptus also increases. In other words, those cows are eating that supplement, they are absorbing the supplement in circulation. That supplement is reaching those omega-6 fatty acids, are changing the composition of fatty acids of the uterus. They're actually delivering some of those fatty acids into the uterine environment, into the uterine fluid. But not only that, those embryos are uptaking those omega-6 fatty acids. And what's interesting is that those studies measured conceptuses of cows being fed omega-6 fatty acids, and they were able to show that the conceptuses were larger when you compare to control cows that were receiving the same amount of energy, the same amount of lipids, but they were receiving lipids that were not reaching omega-6 fatty acids. So in other words, they were able to show that those specific supplements help the conceptuses to elongate better. And not only that, those supplementation strategies actually in fact led to an increase in pregnancy rates. So this is a study done in the Southeast in Virginia, okay, and you can see that here we have the CSSO, which are the group of cows that were fed a supplement reaching omega-6 fatty acids, and the control isocaloric, isolipidic group, and these are pregnancy rates to 1 round of fixed time AI. And you can see there was a 9% significant increase in pregnancy rates in the group of cows that were receiving omega-6 fatty acids. One of the main challenges of these initial studies were the logistics of delivering those omega-6 fatty acids because they were mixed with a carrier back in the day that had to be fed daily. So in a subsequent study that was done by Dr. Cook at Texas A&M, and we actually helped with that study, enrolled some cows here at the University of Georgia in this study as well. Some of the cows were actually in Virginia as well with Dr. Mercadante. So study performed predominantly in the Southeast here. And you can see that whenever those calcium salts of soybean oil were included in a low moisture block, and those blocks were fed to cows throughout the breeding season here, you can see that the cows that were receiving the omega-6 supplement had, again, significantly greater pregnancy rates to fixed time AI. And they also had lower pregnancy loss between the end of the first breeding the end of the breeding season and the final preg check and the subsequent calving. Okay. Not only that, what was neat is that those differences in pregnancy rates of the cows being fed the calcium salts of soybean oil actually led to a greater proportion of cows calving early in the season. So these are weeks in the calving season, and this is the percentage of cows calving here. And you can see that the group that was receiving the omega-6, so the CSSO, a greater proportion of those cows were calving in the first 3 weeks of the calving season. Again, this was predominantly driven by the fact that a greater proportion of those females bred to that initial AI. And when you go there and you look at the actual weaning weight per cow exposed, because of these differences in pregnancy rates to AI, differences in calving distribution here, you can see that on average, cows that were fed, and the treatments are flipped here, okay? So the cows that were fed calcium salts of soybean oil, they had an actual 42-pound advantage when you compare to the control cows, okay? And again, that was driven predominantly by an increase in fertility here. So moving forward here from the nutrition side of things, transitioning into estrus synchronization. We know that estrus synchronization are an excellent tool to manage those postpartum beef cows. We know that a large proportion of those cows are in an estrus before the beginning of the breeding season, and we know that estrus synchronization programs help us mitigate that. Those programs have the ability to induce cyclicity in postpartum cows, and we can leverage that to manage fertility. And I'm going to show some examples here and some considerations from an estrus synchronization standpoint when it comes to managing cow herd fertility. So this is a classic study here in the Southeast, applicable for us here in our reality in the Southeast, done in the Florida Panhandle by Dr. Lamb at the North Florida Research and Educational Center, where basically over the course of 5 years, they got a cow herd that was managed in a traditional breeding approach, right, with a 120-day breeding season, where the majority, where all the breeding events happen by natural service, right? Bulls will turn in on the first day of the breeding season, and they'll pull out 120 days later. And from 2007 to 2012, so over the course of 5 years, what Dr. Lamb and that farm crew did is they gradually decreased the length of the breeding season from 120 to 170 days. And the way they did that was by using pretty heavily estrus synchronization programs, right? Remember I mentioned that estrus synchronization programs that make use of progesterone, they have the ability of get cows that are not cycling at the beginning of the breeding season and jumpstart those cows to start cycling. And by doing that, over the course of 5 years here, you can see that they were able to significantly change how calving events happen in that herd. And that's what I'm going to show you here in this figure. So here on the y-axis, we have the percentage of cows that calved. And on the x-axis, you have the different days of the calving season. So basically, for each one of these lines that I'm going to show you here, each one of these lines represent a different year. And the way this figure works, for example, here for the year of 2007, every time a cow calves within the calving season in that year of 2007, that line moves up, right? So this is what we call a survival analysis. And you can see that as we go from 2007 to 2013, as we decrease the length of the breeding season and we start using estrus synchronization to increase the proportion of cows that breed early, we're able to gradually shift that calving distribution to the left. So if we come here in 2007, you can see that you get 80% of the calf crop on the ground was taking this operation about 90 to 100 days. Whereas when we come here to 2013 to get 80% of the calves on the ground, was taking them only about 50 days. There's a lot of producers that we work with, and some of our herds in the university as well, that have been utilizing synchronization programs for a long time to manage postpartum anestrus, and we see over 70% of the calves hitting the ground within the first 21 days of the calving season. And that has some pretty significant consequences to cow herd performance. And one of the main ones is associated with the calving age. So in this herd here, in this herd from North Florida that has, over the course of 5 years, like I said, transition into a more active reproductive management program, utilizing estrus synchronization programs. The way they manage their cow herd there, every year the breeding season started at the same time, okay? But, and also weaning also happened at the same time. So even though they were starting the breeding season at the same time and weaning calves at the same time of the year every year, because they were creating a greater proportion of cows pregnant early and calving early, they were changing the average age of those calves, because basically those calves were hitting the ground earlier, right? So here is a figure that shows those differences in age, okay? So this is the difference in age of the calves relative to the year of 2007 for each one of the years from 2008 all the way to 2013, as they started utilizing synchronization programs. So you can see here that in 2013, when you compare to 2007, calves are on average 42 days older, right? If you think about your calves, they gain about between 2.5 and 3 pounds a day, right? If you give those calves an opportunity to gain an extra 42 days of opportunity to gain weight, we're significantly increasing the body weight of those calves, okay? So from a fertility standpoint, every time we get those cows pregnant early in the season as well through the utilization of these synchronization programs, we also allowing those cows a greater time to recover before they calve. So you can see that as you go from 2006 to 2007 here, when they had a long breeding season without the use of synchronization, to a tight breeding season where most of the calving events were happening early in the season, you can see that you see a gradual increase in pregnancy rates on that cow herd. Not only that, like I showed you earlier, we increased the average age of those calves, and because we increased the average age of those calves at weaning, again, without changing when we start the breeding season and without changing when we wean the calves are always weaned at the same time of the year. If you assume that those calves, if you're weaning 100 calves here, if you assume that a feeder calf price of $2.60 here, and assume that those calves gain only 2 pounds a day. So again, we're not accounting for any improvement in genetics here. You can see that we're adding value to those calves quite substantially here, right? On a per calf basis, we're adding over 200 pounds in today's feeder calf prices here. If it was a few months ago, this will look a little bit better. If it was a few years ago, depending on where you are from a feeder calf price standpoint, this value will change. But what I want to drive home here is that we're substantially influencing the performance of the calf crop by utilizing and leveraging those synchronization programs. And, because of my extension appointment, I go around the state, and not only around the state, around the country quite a lot, talking about synchronization programs. And I always get asked, what's the best synchronization program? And that really depends. But regardless of the synchronization program that you utilize, and whenever we open up for questions, we can discuss that a little bit more. But regardless of the program that you utilize, one recommendation that I have is to use a protocol that is endorsed by the Beef Reproduction Task Force. So here I have an example of the protocol sheet that is put together by the Beef Reproduction Task Force. You can also scan this QR code that it's also going to take you to the Beef Reproduction Task Force website there. Regardless of the program that you utilize, make sure you utilize one of the programs that it's endorsed by the task force. And the reason for that is because if a program is endorsed by the task force, it basically means that that program has been thoroughly tested in control experiments, and we know the scientific community knows that those programs work really well in the field. Okay, so some other points to make from an ester synchronization standpoint is the compliance aspect. You'll be surprised on how much mistakes happen from an ester synchronization program, from a handling of the product standpoint, or incorrect drug administration. So some things to keep in mind: always use correct needle length. A lot of the ester synchronization drugs, the majority of them are intramuscular. So make sure you have enough length following BQA guidelines to actually deliver that product in the muscle and not subcutaneously. For the products that are subcutaneously, you can afford using a little bit shorter needle, but keep in mind that the bulk of the ester synchronization products are actually supposed to be administered intramuscular. So make sure you read the label and you administer the product accordingly. Not only that, make sure you follow the correct protocol. Those protocols are established in a given way for a reason. Okay, so make sure you follow those protocols exactly how they're laid out in the synchronization protocol sheet, because every time you deviate from that, you can have a train wreck from a pregnancy rate standpoint. Okay. Always triple check product and protocol and so forth. But not only that, make sure that whenever you buy ester synchronization programs, you read the label and you make sure you stores those correctly. Several ester synchronization products are sensitive to fluctuations in temperature, but not only that, light. So very often we see products sometimes left inside a vehicle, right? And it gets hot out there. So this is important to keep in mind. And moving forward here, another question that I always get is what's new in the world of synchronization? And the reality is over the last 4 years, there has been very little improvement on the ester synchronization programs that we have available. Probably the newest development in synchronization programs and it's been the development or the adoption of pre-synchronization programs in beef herds. And by pre-synchronization programs, basically we're talking about the administration of exogenous hormones prior to the initiation of an ester synchronization program. And the idea of doing that is to basically increase the proportion of females that are at a specific stage of the estrus cycle. I'm going to show you how that works in a little bit before we start a synchronization program. And this rationale here is that by getting those cows in a specific stage of the cycle, whenever we start the conventional synchronization protocol, we actually better manipulate the physiology of their cycle, or of their ovary and their brain, right? And by doing that, we increase the proportion of females that show estrus and improve pregnancy rates. This is something that is being thoroughly utilized in the dairy industry, but not as largely adopted or researched in the beef industry. The reason for that is because in the beef industry, you're always trying to minimize the number of trips to the chute. But as producers become more and more familiar with the ester synchronization protocols and with the process of synchronizing cows, some producers, what we learn is that they're willing to run cows to the chute one more time if they can capture a little bit more pregnancy ratio AI. So ultimately, every time we think about pre-synchronization programs, we gotta ask ourselves, well, if we're gonna add a pre-synchronization step, is it worth it, right? What kind of increases do I see from a pregnancy rate standpoint? And if I do see an increase, are those increases justified, right, from a profitability standpoint? So just to give you an overall understanding of how synchronization programs work from a physiology standpoint, and I'll try to be brief here, but basically this is the most common synchronization program utilized in the beef industry. It's what we call the 7 days co-sync placenta program. Basically, this is a program that requires three trips through the chute, so that's why it's super popular. But basically, you run animals or you run your cow herd through the chute on day 0, and when you run them through the chute on day 0, you give an injection of GnRH, okay, and you put an intravaginal CIDR device in those females, okay. And the rationale for using a GnRH up front here is that we induce ovulation in a certain proportion of our cows, okay. Cows, whenever we run them through the first day in the nestro synchronization program, they are at random stages of their cycle. So the rationale of giving that GnRH is to get as many cows as possible to ovulate. So moving forward in that program, as we go from day 0 to day 7, those cows will start a synchronized follicular wave. So cows have a wave-like pattern of follicular growth. So when we go there and run those cows through and we give a GnRH injection, we want the largest amount of cows as possible to start a synchronized follicular wave. So the idea of starting that synchronized follicular wave is to have those cows 7 days later coming through the chute again. And when they come through the chute again, we pull the CIDR out. So we remove a CIDR that was previously inserted on day 0. Okay, and the role of that CIDR is to hold those cows from showing estrus ahead of time. So when we pull that CIDR out, we give those cows a prostaglandin injection. And what that prostaglandin injection will do is break down the corpus luteum, okay, for the cows that do have a corpus luteum present. And what that does basically tells the ovary of the cow to decrease progesterone production. And when we see a decrease in progesterone production, what that does is enhances stimulus in the reproductive system of the cow to promote follicular development. So when that follicle that is carrying the oocyte grows, it produces estrogen and it makes those cows exhibit estrus. And hopefully those cows will exhibit estrus in a timely manner so we can come in here, give an exogenous injection of GnRH, okay, give another GnRH injection, and time breed those cows and make sure that those cows are going to ovulate within a window of time where the sperm cells that we're putting in when we're artificially inseminating those cows are going to be viable to fertilize the egg. Okay? And that all sounds beautiful if 100% of the cows responded perfectly to the protocol. But the reality is only about 60% of the cows and actually less than 40% of the heifers respond to this initial GnRH. And every time a female fails to respond to this GnRH, that means that the synchrony of the subsequent follicular wave here is going to be slightly off on those females. Okay, when that happens, those females might show heat a little bit earlier than they're supposed to, or they might not show heat at all in the synchronization program. So every time we talk about pre-synchronization program, basically we're trying to add a step to the synchronization program to optimize the number of cows or increase the number of cows that respond to this GnRH here. So this is the most popular approach currently available in the industry to pre-synchronize cows is what we call the 7 and 7 sync, where basically instead of putting the CIDR in for only 7 days, we're actually going to come in 7 days earlier and put that CIDR in 7 days earlier. This day we put the CIDR in, we go there and give a prostaglandin injection, and what that does, it breaks down the CL, and remember, when we break down the CL, we decrease progesterone, which causes the follicles to grow. And because those cows have a CIDR here, those cows will not ovulate beforehand, okay? And what that does is going to get those cows to have a really large follicle, and we know that the ability of the follicle to ovulate to this GnRH is associated with the size. So the larger the follicle, the more likely that follicle is to respond to this GnRH. So when we add this pre-synchronization step, we increase the size of the follicle and we give GnRH. And when we do that, we optimize this ovulatory response to this GnRH. Okay, and the goal here is to have a more synchronized subsequent follicular wave. greater estrus expression, and hopefully greater fertility whenever we expose those females to a pre-synchronization. So the initial work using these pre-synchronization strategies, which is not super novel, it's been around for a long time, it's just becoming more popular in the industry, was done in replacement heifers. So this is some work led by Dr. Mercadante, not the initial work, but the larger scale validation work that replicated the initial studies, where basically they compare replacement heifers that were exposed to the 7 and 7 with heifers that were exposed to a controlled treatment here, which will be the conventional 7-day program. Okay, and you can see that those replacement heifers after this general age injection, regardless of whether they were in the control or the treatment group, they were managed pretty much the same. And you can see that by using that pre-synchronization program, what Victor was able to show here is that a greater proportion of those females express estrus, but not only that, a greater proportion of them actually become pregnant. To what extent do they increase pregnancy rates? On average, about 10%. Okay, that's what we see in the field and in control studies when it comes to increase in fertility when we expose cows to synchronization programs that have a pre-sync approach, okay, like the 7 and 7 sync. Same thing has been replicated in cows, and this is data out of Missouri. They led a lot of the studies that were done in mature postpartum beef cows. And again, similar experimental design here, cows either exposed to the 7-day program or to the 7-7 sync, so with or without pre-synchronization. And you can see that you see a greater proportion of the cows in the pre-synchronized group showing estrus, and also about a 10%, 11% increase in pregnancy rates here. This is their data with conventional semen. They also did that with sex semen, and they observed similar increases in pregnancy rates. Keep in mind that those results are not always constant, right? Estrus synchronization programs are just a piece of the puzzle when it comes to cow herd fertility, as I'm trying to show you here. And you can see that in this different study here, they saw no difference, only a 2% increase here, numerical increase, not statistical increase in pregnancy rates in cows exposed to the 7 and 7 versus the 7 days. So with that, I want to mention briefly stress as well. We know that stress is a big driver of fertility too. And there are different ways we can think about stress. And the example that I'm showing you here is transportation stress or handling stress. So these are females here in experiment 1 and 2. Experiment 1, those are females that were transported after one round of artificial insemination, 1 to 4 days after that insemination, or 14 days after that insemination. And you can see that the females that were transported 14 days after AI, they had decreased pregnancy rates compared to the ones that were transported shortly after AI. And the reason for that is because around day 14, 15, that's when those embryos are starting to increase in size or exponentially increase in size, elongating the uterus. So this is a key period of development in the uterus. So you can see that every time we expose cows to a stress event, whether it's transportation or just working those females, you can see these are cows that were handled between 10 to 15 days after AI. You can see that you also see a decrease in fertility there. So just subtle events of stress minimize the likelihood of those females to successfully conceive to AI. Now I want to briefly touch on the male aspect of it. Okay, so we know that there's a variety of factors related to the male, and Dr. Zoka spent a lot of time talking about this. So I encourage you to go back to his presentation and take a look at that. So if you were not here last week, you can scan this QR code and that will take you to the video of Dr. Zoka's presentation. But basically, one of the points that I want to make here is whether you're utilizing AI, right, or you're utilizing natural service only. Ultimately, very few of us are relying only on AI, right? Most of us, even if we're AI, we're also relying on natural service as well. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to perform a breeding soundness exam on a yearly basis. We know that bulls lose fertility from 1 year to the next, and we try to accomplish that around 40, 60 days before the beginning of the breeding season in case that bull fails the BSC. Remember that a BSC is not only a semen test, right? It also has a physical examination component of it. We know that bulls not only need to be able to shoot or ejaculate a good quality semen, but they actually need to be able to go out there, chase cows and ride cows, right? So physical examination is a key component of a true breeding soundness exam. Not only that, examination of the reproductive tract, whether we're talking about the testes or spermatic cord, scrotal circumference, scrotum characteristics, but also sex accessory glands, so palpating those balls is important. And of course, there's the semen component of the breeding soundness exam, all of which will be done by your veterinarian. And, will serve as a good insurance policy to make sure that those bulls are able to go out there and breed cows. Keep in mind that a breeding soundness exam does not guarantee 100% that the bull is going to be able to breed cows. So there's also the libido component, right? So this is important to keep in mind. One of the things that I always encourage folks to do is whenever you turn bulls out, make sure that the bull is actively chasing cows. Mainly, we're dealing with young bulls that do not have a history of actively generating pregnancies. Okay. In the context of artificial insemination, some of the good recommendations to minimize the risk of having lower pregnancy rates than we would like to have is to buy semen from reputable sources, right? We know that the good companies, the majority of the companies, semen companies, do an excellent job when it comes to quality controls from a semen standpoint, right? So every time you buy from a reputable company, you're minimizing the risk of having a lower quality product from a fertility standpoint. But not only that, make sure you follow recommendations, both from a semen storage, not only that, but also a semen handling standpoint. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time making recommendations from a semen handling standpoint, but I do want to point out to a good resource, which is a presentation put together by the Beef Reproduction Task Force, done by Dr. Dalton, where he spends over an hour going in detail on how we can minimize damage to semen straws. And for those of you that are going to be breeding cows this fall, I really encourage you to go there and take a look at his presentation, because every time I watch his presentation, I change a little bit the way that I handle semen myself. So keep that in mind. Make sure you use that as a resource to minimize those risks. And another key component that is very important from a fertility standpoint is health, right? We know the health of the cow herd, not only that, but bulls and replacement heifers as well, is very important from a fertility standpoint. But not only that, when it comes to health management and vaccination, there's a lot of details related to the type of vaccine, whether we're dealing with an activated or dead vaccine or a modified live vaccine, and the timing of those vaccinations. We know some of these products can influence fertility, right? So we got to be mindful of that. So with that, I want to make a recommendation for you to work with your local veterinarian when it comes to developing your vaccination program in order to maximize the chances of minimizing any health-related issues or any vaccine-related issues with fertility in your program, whether you're using natural service or artificial insemination or embryo transfer. So with that, I see that I'm about 45 minutes in, so I'm going to get ready to wrap up and open up for questions. But before I do that, I just wanted to, have a wrap-up slide here, okay? So just to kind of summarize some of the points that I try to make, some of the key take-home messages. There's not a silver bullet when it comes to cow herd fertility. As I showed you, there's a variety of factors that are going to influence the ability of cows to become pregnant. And those factors do in fact play a role. But not only that, there are factors that we are not aware of that do play a role in fertility as well. So I think our objective as producers is to do the best we can to understand the factors that we do know, right, from research and from experience in the field that influence fertility, and develop ways to manage our cow herd accordingly based on these factors that we know influence fertility. Okay, and by doing that, we can hopefully maximize pregnancy rates. And in a situation where we have lower pregnancy rates than we are expecting, understanding those factors can also help us troubleshoot fertility issues and try to understand where we might have made a mistake and try to minimize those mistakes moving forward. So with that, Mallory, I'll turn it over to you, and or I guess I can pull up the questions myself here if that works for you as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fontes. I see we have a couple questions popping up in our Q&A box, which is great. And if anyone has any that they'd like to put in the chat box as well, we can jump back and forth in between those. So I think the two or three now we have are in our Q&A box.
Sure, I can go ahead and get started here, Mallory, if that's okay with you. So the first question is, how long can a cow produce? And that depends. Okay, so that depends on several things. Ideally, we want to have cows stay in the herd for at least 4 years. Okay, in order for that cow to be profitable. Okay, so every time we cull a cow um, with less than 4 years of production, okay, before those cows put four calves in the ground, those cows fail to pay for their development costs. Does that mean we need to keep them around if they fail to breed, for example? No, we don't. But it is important to identify those cows and recognize that those cows, from an investment standpoint, they were not very profitable cows. Okay. Ideally, we want to have cows last as long as possible, as long as they meet our production expectations. Ideally, you're going to have your good cows lasting over 8 years. We know that there's a big breed influence there. We know that Brahman influenced cows tend to have a little bit greater longevity in the herd, and so do cows that are crossbred. We know that crossbreeding can help us increase the average longevity of the herd. But one thing that I would encourage you to do is calculate your average longevity as well. Okay. And have an idea on how long your cows are lasting in your production system. Ideally, you want those cows to last as long as possible, but the reality is very often those cows fail to meet our production expectations earlier than we would like them to. So now I'm going to move forward to the next question here. What feed sources have soybean oil, and how would this appear on a feed tub label? This is a great question. So one of the things that I didn't mention, okay, is that the soybean oil and any polyunsaturated fatty acid supplementation, okay, every time someone talks about feeding omega-6 or omega-3 fatty acids, it is important to understand that those fatty acids, they're broken down in the rumen. So if we feed cows omega-6 fatty acids, the rumen bacteria will convert those fatty acids from a saturated source from an unsaturated source to a more saturated source of fatty acid. So every time you're looking for a product that it's going to elicit those responses, it's important to be what we call a protected product, or in this case of the calcium salts of soybean oil, they're going to be sold as a calcium salt. Okay. And what the calcium salt is a manufacturing approach of that ingredient. So they're going to get the soybean oil, and they're going to go through a processing of that soybean oil that adds the calcium salt to the product. And what that will do, we will protect that product partially from degradation in the rumen, meaning that a certain proportion of those omega-6 fatty acids are actually going to make it to the small intestines and be absorbed. The product that I share with you, the data, the study used a product called Ascension, okay, which is an Arm & Hammer product. There's some other polyunsaturated sources out there in the market. The way you recognize in a tub is by finding the products that are included in the tub. Okay, so if they have products like the Ascension that are calcium salts of soybean oil, you know that they're going to be getting a product that has a protected source of polyunsaturated fatty acids. I cannot emphasize enough, it needs to have some type of protection. Okay, otherwise it's just a fat source like any other fat source, like palm oil, for example. Okay, and all the beneficial effects that I showed you in those research projects that I shared with you, they were done in an isocaloric and isolipidic control comparison. In other words, the benefits that were not associated with the energy. Okay, the energy helps, if the cows are negative energy balance, if you provide more energy through a lipid supplement, yeah, you're gonna help her from energy balance standpoint, okay? But those beneficial effects to the conceptus elongation and beneficial effects of fertility that I showed, they were associated with the profile of fatty acids, okay? So keep that in mind. So the next question that I have, it's also about the product, the omega-6 fatty acid product. I just mentioned that study used the Ascension, okay? Um, Then the other question here is, what do you recommend for a mineral standpoint? From a mineral standpoint, I don't have a set recommendation for when it comes to mineral from a specific product standpoint. Just make sure that as you go through the mineral product or the label of your mineral, you either reach out to a nutritionist or you communicate with your local extension folks. They'll help you with that. But basically, we need to make sure that each one of the minerals that are included in that mineral supplement that you're buying, they're actually included in a rate that will meet the requirements of your cows. Okay. And you keep in mind that some minerals can exceed in concentration in the diet as well, depending on the type of mineral, on the mineral composition of your forage. And your extension people can help you with that, and so can a nutritionist help you with that as well. Some other comments that I would like to make from a mineral standpoint, there's some research that would suggest that organic, not only organic, but mineral sources, they're more bioavailable, okay, also have a favorable effect on fertility. Okay, so this is something important to keep in mind as well. As you're thinking about purchasing a mineral product, be aware that products have different bioavailability, and that influences how the animal is going to utilize those minerals, and the way those animals utilize minerals influences their ability to breed. So keep that in mind as well. So the next question I have here is, how early can we wean a calf? You can wean a calf really early if you need to, but keep in mind that when you wean a calf earlier, you're going to have to make sure you're meeting the nutrient requirements of that calf. Okay. Usually a calf relies quite substantially on milk, mainly during the first few months of life in order to meet the requirements. So if you're going to early wean calves, you got to make sure you're providing enough nutrition for that calf to continue to develop. Early weaning is a great strategy to help in a situation of drought. Let's say if you are in a situation in a given year the cows are losing condition and you have commodity prices that would justify you weaning calves a little bit earlier and feeding those calves separately from the cows. By taking the calf out of the cow, that helps those cows quit lactating. And we know when those cows quit lactating, they start requiring less nutrients, right? So with the nutrients that we have available, they tend to gain a little bit better condition. So if you are in a situation of low forage availability, early weaning can be used strategically to manipulate the condition of the cow herd, okay, and consequently influence performance positively, mainly in first calf heifers. Okay, there's a lot of research that supports that, even here in the Southeast. But again, it's really on a case-by-case basis. And to make an educated decision on that, again, talk to your local extension, your nutritionist, right? You guys have good extension specialists there in Tennessee that can help you with that. So if you're thinking about potentially doing an early calving, that's my recommendation. I would reach out with a true nutritionist and try to develop a plan there. Now moving forward here, in a timed AI program, why are heifers bred at a different time after CIDR removal? That's a great question. So usually when we synchronize, let's say, a group of cows in a 7-day program, when we pull the CIDR out and we give a prostaglandin injection, We breed cows. The interval between that prostaglandin injection and AI in cows is, the recommendation is 60, 66 hours, whereas heifers is only 54 hours. And the reason for that is because of the wave pattern of follicular development in the heifers. It's a little bit different. Okay, and what happens in those replacement heifers is that ovulate a little bit earlier than cows do in those synchronization programs. Okay, so for that reason, there has been trials that tested different timings of inseminations, and they were able to show that if heifers are bred a little bit earlier, 54 hours after we pull that seeder device, their pregnancy rates are slightly higher. Okay, slightly greater. So that's why we make that recommendation. Sometimes you have folks running cows and heifers. In Georgia, you have a lot of small producers, and a lot of in Tennessee as well. You have several small producers that might be synchronizing cows and heifers or managing cows and heifers as a single group. We all know that's not ideal, but sometimes that's the reality, right? If you have to breed your heifers, if you have to decide whether you're going to breed them at 54 or 60 hours, 60, 66 hours, I'd recommend you to breed your heifers a little bit later than breed your cows a little bit earlier. Okay, so it's not going to be a train wreck if you AI your heifers a little bit later, about 6 hours later. Okay, but again, ideally you want to be at 54 hours there. Another point that I want to make with that question is that depending on the protocol you're utilizing, the timing will change. Okay, so keep that in mind. So like I said, if you Google beef repro, if you go to beefrepro.org, or if you Google Beef Reproduction Task Force, you can find the timing of each one of those protocols. And I cannot emphasize enough, follow the exact timing and the exact pattern of injections. If you're going to have to deviate from that, and sometimes life happens, you got to deviate from that, make sure you call someone that has a large experience in those synchronization programs. I get a lot of calls like that, and I'm happy to guide people on how to overcome some of those scheduling issues when it comes to synchronization programs. There in Tennessee, you guys have Dr. Zoka. He also has the expertise to help you with that. Sometimes, you might need to pull the seeder a day earlier or a day later, which you should never do that, but you might have to. So depending on the situation, you might be able to tweak that program a little bit. So reach out to your local extension folks, and they'll be able to guide you in the right direction there. So moving forward to the next question, what is the best time to preg check? That's sorry, that's a complicated question. Like most questions in extension, it depends. So if you're just trying to determine whether cows are pregnant or not, one of the things that you got to keep in mind is that in order to properly differentiate pregnant cows from open cows and make culling decisions, those cows need to be separated from a bull. Okay, that's the first point I want to make. The second one is that those cows need to be separated from the bull for at least 30 days if you're bringing someone in to preg check your cows, either with an ultrasound or you're collecting blood samples to do a blood test. You got to wait at least 30 days for that test, whether ultrasound you might be able to go 28 days, 27 days, depending on how well trained your veterinarian is. But ideally, you want to wait at least 30 days to start checking those females for pregnancy. From a rectal palpation standpoint, I would recommend at least 45 days before you preg check those females. And by 45 days, I mean 45 days after you pull the bull out. What I see a lot of folks do is, if you're not going to make an immediate decision on cows to, if for you there's no value to knowing early which cows you're going to cull at the time of weaning, what a lot of people would do is do their final preg check, assuming you have a controlled breeding season, whenever they are weaning calves. So for example, in Georgia, it's very common for us, for our spring calving herds, and so is in Tennessee, right? For us to start our breeding season late March, early April, right? So if you are running a 70-day breeding season there, starting in April, 70 days later you pull your bulls out, you could potentially do your preg check around Labor Day. Whenever you're weaning those calves, you have your veterinarian over. By then, it will be more than 30 days. you can preg check those females and sort pregnant and open ones. You're going to be sorting calves, right? You can make that decision there. You can recognize those open females there. A lot of producers that we work with in our herds ourselves, we want to know that we want that information beforehand, so we can plan how we're going to manage those open cows. So usually, by the time we pull the bull out, we wait about 40 days, and we're going to run those cows through, and we're going to preg check them all, figure out who got pregnant, who didn't, and then from there, make a nutritional plan for those open cows. See if we're going to try to maybe add condition to those cows or not before we market them. We might early wean them depending on the market direction. So we like to have that information early, so you can do that as well. So it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're just trying to figure out who's pregnant, who is open, I would try to minimize the amount of times you run those animals through the chute, spend less time working them, and I'll try to do them around the time you're weaning them. So like I said, for a spring calving herd, if you breed beginning of April, you probably want to wean somewhere around, you're going to calve around January, February, start calving. And then you're probably going to wean around this time of the year. So right now we're weaning a lot of our calves in our spring calving herds. All right, so we got another question here. For a heifer that has not started cycling, how does synchronizing them cause them to come into heat? Yes, for both. So that's a good question. Okay. So both heifers and cows sometimes are not cycling before we start the breeding season. Okay. So heifers, they wouldn't be cycling because they haven't reached puberty yet, right? And some heifers don't. A certain proportion of our heifers have not reached puberty when we're ready to start the breeding season. And from a cow standpoint, cows are in what we call postpartum anestrus, and we discussed that during my presentation, right? Those cows, after they calve for about 30 to 90 days, depending on the body condition score of those cows are going to be in what we call postpartum anestrus. Okay, so for both cows and heifers, whenever we expose them to a synchronization program, what those synchronization programs do, and it needs to be a synchronization program that has a progesterone device, okay, or a progesterone source, either a CEDAR device or an MGA, which is a progesterone that is orally fed to heifers, not to cows, just to heifers, okay. Whenever we expose those females to progesterone, progesterone elicits a series of physiological responses that get those females to start cycling, okay. Will 100% of the females start cycling after we expose them to progesterone, let's say for 7 days? No, but a good proportion of them will. So those females that are borderline to start cycling, they will start cycling whenever we expose them to progesterone. And I'll argue that when you think about a synchronization program in AI, that's probably one of the main benefits of those programs, is our ability to overcome postpartum anestrus and get those females pregnant a little bit earlier than we normally would, whether we're talking about prepubertal replacement heifers or postpartum anestrus cows. I think that's the last question I see here, Mallory. Am I missing one? Oh, another one came in. At what age does a heifer? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, you're good. I saw this one pop up as well, and then we had one in our chat box too that I can read off to you as soon as we finish up in the Q&A box.
Sure. Let me tackle this one here. At what age does a heifer calf reach puberty? It depends on the breed. Okay, so usually your British breeds are going to reach a little bit earlier. Okay, anywhere between 10 and 12 months, those females will reach puberty. Okay, that will be the expected age in which those females are going to reach puberty. Sometimes they are a little bit outliers. They might reach puberty a little bit earlier than that. And sometimes they are outliers on the other end of the spectrum, right? They might reach puberty a little bit later than we would expect you. When we go from British breeds to continental breeds, we tend to see about a 2-month delay in the age in which they reach puberty. Not a lot, but a little bit. And then when we go into the Bos Indicus breed, so our Brahman cattle and Brahman-influenced females, the age of puberty increases a little bit more. Okay, so from a Brahman standpoint, those females are going to reach puberty very often after they're 16 months of age. But again, age of puberty is really dependent on the environment that these females are exposed to. So we know that depending on how we manage Brahman influenced heifers, they might reach puberty a little bit earlier than that. And the main driver of age of puberty is first genetics, second energy in the diet. Okay, so we know that energy in the diet is a main factor there. All right, Mallory, I'll turn it over to you for the question in the Q&A.
Sounds good. There were two that popped up, so I'll just read them one by one. The first one is, how accurate or reliable are the shoot side tests that are available on the market? And is there one that is better? I've worked with Dr. Zoka on a protocol that require a shoot side test, but I haven't asked him.
Yes, no, it's the shoot side pregnancy test, the blood tests in general, they work really well. Okay. When you compare them to a gold standard, that would be the ultrasound, right? Not rectal palpation, the ultrasound is the gold standard. Those blood tests are greater than 90-95% accurate. That's what control studies show. You might be asking yourself, why it's not 100%? Well, the reality is sometimes, we have females. The main reasons for misdiagnosis with the blood test is first human error, right? We write down the wrong ID in the tube. If you write down the wrong ID, it doesn't matter how accurate the test is, the test can be wrong, or the test can be wrong. And the other reason is pregnancy loss. Okay, so what those tests do, they will measure the circulating concentration of a protein that is produced by the placenta of the cow, okay, or a group of proteins that is produced by the placenta of the cow. And it usually takes a few days for those proteins to get cleared out from circulation if a cow loses a pregnancy. Okay, so if I had a cow that was pregnant last week, and I go there, do a study comparing the shoot side pregnancy test with the ultrasound. I go there, collect my blood sample and do the shoot side pregnancy test, and then I scan an ultrasound and see that she's open with an ultrasound, but she was pregnant last week. So she's still going to have some circulation of that protein from last week's pregnancy that she lost. And the test is probably going to tell you that the cow is pregnant, but the reality is she's open. But those are really rare occasions. So in other words, from a practical standpoint, you can trust the blood-based pregnancy tests, both the ones you send to a laboratory, as well as the ones that are commercially available. At least no. All the research that I've seen, and from our experience, I do field days showcasing those shoot side pregnancy tests, and we check hundreds of cows in those field days, and it's pretty accurate.
Awesome. And then our last one, just to condense it a little bit, approximately when and age do these beef females quit breeding?
Like I said, it depends, right? It depends on the cow. So ideally, you want to have females for like 6-7 years in the herd. Sometimes some females will be culled before that. Sometimes some females will stay longer than that. And those are the ones we're interested in. Okay. Ultimately, from a fertility standpoint, females that keep becoming pregnant from a fertility standpoint, and those females are able to raise a calf successfully, right, and maintain their body condition score. There's no limit to their age. The reality is, biologically, they're going to eventually quit becoming pregnant. But for the most part, I don't recommend folks culling based on age unless they want to renew their genetics, right? They're interested on replacing their older genetics for more updated genetics. So let's say for the last 5 years, I've been selecting bulls they're really good, or I've been utilizing artificial insemination, right? And I'm really interested on the replacement heifers that I'm generating, and I want my cow herd to be comprised of replacement heifers with those genetics. Then yeah, you might look at your older cows and say, you're being productive, but still, I'll call you to replace with a younger heifer. So that's an option, okay? But the reality is, once those females have been developed and they've been in the herd and they put a few calves on the ground, you spend a lot of money to develop those females and to get them in a breeding age. If you can fit them in an operation and they're able to produce calves and maintain condition, I don't see why you would cull them based on age, unless they decrease production. So a way to think that I encourage people to think about it is establish your production criteria, right? Like I mentioned earlier, we want those females to calve once a year. You want them to wean a healthy calf that you can, take it to the sale barn, and that calf's going to look healthy. It's gonna be heavy, ideally. It's gonna be a good quality calf, and that female is breeding back. As long as she's meeting those production expectations, and you like the quality of the calves that she's putting on the ground, I don't see a reason to cull them. Okay, just because they're older, unless you don't have space to expand the herd and you want to update your genetics based on the replacements you're generating. So then yes.
All right. I think that wraps up our questions that I have in the Q&A and chat box right now. Um, I did want to touch on one thing before we ended tonight too. You mentioned a couple of times the Beef Reproduction Task Force, and I've heard about all of the great things that come along with it. Would you mind to share what that is with our group and just some of the resources that are with that?
Sure. So you can find us on all the social media. I'm a member of the Beef Reproduction Task Force. So if you just Google Beef Reproduction Task Force, you're gonna find our website. If you go on Facebook, we're there. On Instagram, we're there too. Twitter, we're everywhere. We're more active on Facebook because that's where most of our audience is. Okay. But we're also on YouTube, and I would really encourage you to go to our YouTube page because there's a lot of valuable content there. So we organize webinars, okay, several webinars every year, similar to this one, this series here that is being put together by the University of Tennessee, but they're all focused on reproduction. Okay, so you can go there and you can find dozens of videos with experts from all over the world, the best experts in reproduction, giving talks on how you can improve fertility, take advantage of reproductive technologies in your herd. So I really encourage you to do that. The Beef Reproduction Task Force, if you're not familiar with, it's a group of reproductive physiologists like me that have an extension appointment and that spend a lot of their time thinking cow herd fertility. and we basically work as a group to develop recommendations to the industry. Okay, so when we talk about protocols, for example, endorsed by the Beef Reproduction Task Force, on a yearly basis, we get together, not only us, professors at the universities, but also we get together with our leadership group, which has several individuals from the industry as well. And we review all the literature and all the field fertility data on synchronization programs, and we make updates to estrogen synchronization programs. So every time you buy a SIRE catalog and you see a description of estrogen synchronization protocols, those were all established during those yearly meetings. Okay, so if you go back home and you utilize one of the synchronization programs, we know that if you have any type of issues with fertility, we know that they're not going to be associated with the way you're synchronizing cows, for example. Besides the webinars, the protocols, we also put together an annual meeting, which is called the ARSBC, or the Applied Reproductive Strategies for Beef Cattle. Last year, the meeting was this year, sorry, the meeting was a few weeks ago here in Athens. And we'll be soon announcing our 2025 meeting as well. And basically, we rotate around the country. Last year, we were in Wyoming. The year before, trying to remember, we were in Texas. and it will basically rotate around. We've been in most states of the country trying to reach out beef cattle producers, talking about fertility and reproductive programs and assisted reproductive technologies.
Great. Thank you for sharing more about that. I know Dr. Zoka speaks so highly of that group, and I should have asked him last week to talk more about it as well, but I'm glad you brought that up in your slides. Um, I don't see any more questions in our Q&A and chat box, but if anyone has any questions they think about after the webinar tonight, please send them to me and I'd be happy to get those to Dr. Fontes so we could answer those. Again, thank you, Dr. Fontes, for being on here with us tonight. We certainly appreciate you joining us. For night 7 of our webinar series, we're just about to wrap up on Thursday, actually, so a perfect time and a good note to start slowing down and ending on. So we're super excited you've decided to join us. And again, if anyone has any questions regarding attendance or certification or anything along that matter, please be sure to reach out to your local extension agent or myself, and we'll get those cleared up for you. But with all that being said, we'll wrap up. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mallory. Thanks for having me.